Special Operations Training Detachment, SOT D West, Burrow Team. Coming at you from NTC, Off the Radar.
This is Off the Radar. I'm Captain Weston Rich, an observer coach trainer for the Green Berets at the National Training Center. This is the second and final part of our conversation on Special Operations Military Intelligence. The first part covers some really great information, so go back and give that episode a listen. In this episode, Dylan describes his experiences preparing for and executing rotations at the National Training Center and the Joint Readiness Training Center. What training did you guys do as the Ranger Regiment to prepare for a regimental rotation at the National Training Center?
Yeah, so I was still fresh to the organization, but it's almost like a month after I showed up, we were having bi-weekly targeting meetings on how we were going to, get from sensor to shooter, whatever that looked like, practicing those battle drills, refining them, updating our systems, doing staff X's, at least bi-weekly. We put a lot of emphasis on NTC and took it very seriously. So it was good training. But from my foxhole, it was very much just going through the targeting cycle and kind of validating what we already knew, and some other ideas that we wanted to test. Some other things like, I just lost it. But I guess I'll go on. One of the big things that during that time, the regiment was still kind of going through the transition from the pullout in Afghanistan to what our current operational environment is now. And so we designed what's called the Ranger Operating Concept, the ROC, if you will. And so NTC was kind of like our proof of concept for this, and was very heavily involved in the intel side. And I think it's practically like, to put it in layman's terms, you think of it in terms of like Z, Y, X. Well, the Z is here in Georgia, where we have our Regimental Intelligence Operating Center, the RIOC, where we have put all of our analytical manpower 24 hours on, and they can, as long as the communications nodes are working properly, they can do all their intelligence assessments from home without having to worry about things like I had to worry about on 173rd, like putting analysts on security to secure the talk because you're behind enemy lines and you're in a contested environment. Well, you keep them in the rear so they can solely focus on assessment and targeting efforts, and then they pass that information forward. We still have intelligence analysts, like a contingent forward in the JOC, which is on the Y, and a lot of the rest of your staff is there on the Y at your forward staging base, and they're doing the direct mission command of that headquarters of that Ranger battalion, and then obviously the battalion or Ranger company, whatever strike force you're sending in, goes in on the X. So that's kind of like how we broke down the Ranger operating concept. It was very much a theory at that point by the time I arrived, and we used NTC to prove it. So much of the staff, definitely at the regimental headquarters, took train up to NTC very seriously, and by virtue of bi-weekly targeting syncs, testing processes and systems, making sure that battle drills, like Colonel Kiersey demanded a lot of us. We had a lot of I don't want to say put on dog and pony shows, but we had to put on rehearsals for him to demonstrate, like, hey, we're taking this seriously.
Rehearsals are important.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think and legitimately, I think it paid off. We had a little bit of on the ground learning, like learn some things, like comms weren't working entirely once we first got on the ground when we thought we were FOC. Certain breaks here and there. But ultimately, by day 3, day 4, like we were cooking pretty hard and proved that concept pretty hard. I think a lot of conventional units are starting to pick up on that mentality as well. I saw an article a while back about 101st going to a JRTC rotation, and they implemented a similar. They left a lot of their like C2 brigade planners, intelligence from the BICE back at Fort Campbell or off-site from the box, so they could focus solely on the planning and stuff, not necessarily like having to set up this mega talk that has a massive EW signature and just physical signature. but they can still feed all that, those products to the commander on the ground. So there's advantages and disadvantages, sure, but ultimately I think it was more advantageous because I think we frustrated both.
Oh, all right. Hey, you're back. I think that's a cool concept, and I get the point of like having certain MOSs and whatnot away from the contested area so that they can actually focus more. They have the connectivity, they have the infrastructure, they have the ability. All they need is that connected communication with, those that are closer or going to the objective. So what's the general like lag time on SSE and sensitive site exploitation and things that Rangers are doing on the objective? Then it gets back to the intel analysis. Like how long does that take?
I'm thinking back to one specific example. I got my hands on some SSE that 175. They had just finished, I think it was maybe a platoon raid or something, and one of the guys just casually mentioned to me like, "Hey, they got a binder over there with like all these ops graphics and stuff." So I was like, "Oh, let me go grab that." So I literally just walked over and I grabbed it, or obviously I talked it over with them, and they're like, "Oh yeah, we pulled this off the site." So we did a cursory look with the analysts I had in my row. Meantime, we scanned it and sent that back to the jock back here at Fort Moore, and they did a little bit deeper analysis. So we gave them about 24 hours. Yeah, there was virtually no lag other than like, hey, we said like, hey, we're going to give you. It was a self-imposed like 24 hours to assess this and see if we can. Ultimately, it came back. It was just too small. There wasn't anything like high value from it. It was just like battle positions on a couple houses that they had already raided. But to answer that point though, yeah, the SSE though, it was I'd say was like relatively quick, and we had our analysts on it there at the jock, which was simulated on an island that was like several hundred miles away anyway, mind you. But then also sending that back to the rear simulated CONUS as well. I think that is still pretty realistic though in our organization.
And then BICE is a brigade intelligence function separate from, or is that inside of like the brigade engineer? Or am I just like completely ignorant of how all this works?
No, you're good. It's confusing even to me sometimes because they change it, and especially with like a lot of the force design updates that are going on across the force with a lot of MI companies. Other than the separate brigades like the 173rd, all the MI companies, as I understand it, are getting pulled up. It's like all the engineers are getting pulled up. It's really going to be like division owned. But from what I understood, essentially how, like during my time, it was like the MICO was responsible for manning, training, equipping, and then providing those analyst supports to form the BICE that worked for the Brigade S2. We have a similar thing here. The RMIB is responsible for training, manning, equipping all intel disciplines, and then sending at times like task organizing, those intelligence collectors, whether they're human intelligence, counterintelligence, signals, or all source, task organizing them to either a battalion or to the regimental S2 if it's a regimental mission at certain times.
Okay.
So that's kind of how that relationship works. They're borrowed manpower.
Yeah, appreciate it. Well, sometimes that has its advantages and sometimes it has its disadvantages.
For sure.
Taking IMTO positions from one, rob Peter to pay Paul kind of thing. With that NTC rotation, like as far as MI intelligence stuff, was there anything missing? Was the scenario lacking for you guys? Was it robust enough? Or
yeah, so overall, like I said earlier, I thought it was pretty good training. There were a handful of shortfalls, and like I said, there was a lot of organizational learning between us and NTC. I think we had a good balance of like, we certainly learned from the OCTs, and the OCTs learned about us. There were some other things like synchronizing some of our offsite training that we were conducting in other areas across the state outside of NTC's purview that kind of like frustrated at times. That was, but that's hard. It was. I don't think there's really a good way to get around that. It was just because it's outside of their realm, but it was something a higher headquarters requirement that we had to train. Specifically to the MI though, a lot of things that I've gotten experience with here as opposed to conventional force is the interagency and intelligence community coordination and activities that we do with them. That was extremely hard to replicate at NTC. I think we just built some sort of injects and had a handful of in-house role players that were trying to play front side and back side, and it got kind of wonky. But I think we learned from that. And then this past year at this JRTC rotation, the RSOV rotation we had was 7th group. I think we replicated that pretty well. Like they sought to put on they had a country team, and it actually felt real. Like these guys actually had some WASTA behind them. And I remember sitting in a VTC dressed up in suit and tie, talking with the role player chief of station, and it was like, wow, this is game on. Like this is real. This guy knows what he's talking about. It makes it feel real. Like I've got to actually mind my B's and Q's here. I think that was just from that NTC rotation. That was probably the one thing that we were probably critically lacking because in that sort of crisis, the scenario that we were operating in, like the intelligence community, wider intelligence community is definitely going to bring forth all that they had to bear if that were a real world like situation.
Yeah, absolutely. I wish I had been here to see that, although I would have been brand new and not really knowing what was going on, because my first rotation was the one right after 75th came to National Training Center. But we have civil affairs and psychological operations professionals working with various people to expand our role player presence. And we have a lot of great role players, and we're getting better and better every iteration, where we have role players that have years and years of SOF experience come here, and they may or may not have interagency experience as well. Like you mentioned, a guy that was playing a chief of station that felt real. So it's good to hear that, you came back and did another rotation at a CTC a year later, and you're like, oh, wow, I can feel like there's a marked improvement. So, because we're always trying to improve as well. And I would say anyone that was at that NTC rotation 2 Aprils ago, a year and a half or so ago, that if you came back out to NTC, it'd probably be a completely different problem set and a more robust and complex problem set. Thank you for bringing up your experience at Joint Readiness Training Center. Was there anything lacking on that? I know that the main focus versus the NTC rotation, where it was the 75th rotation, the main focus of that JRTC rotation was 7th group. So you guys were kind of on the periphery doing other things. But it kind of sounds like what you were doing got supported well enough that you were getting good training value. If not, feel free to correct me. But what was your takeaway from the JRTC experience?
Yeah. So, exactly like your point. You kind of took the words out of my mouth. Like, 7th group was the lead audience, and we were kind of like second fiddle in that. So we knew we were supporting, and we were task organized under the CJ SOTF because we were in 05 headquarters for that training exercise, and it was all of our special troops battalion and ARMIB enablers. So not even a Ranger like strike force going in. So got to play with a little bit more of our exquisite toys and demonstrate to JRTC and 7th group, like, hey, these are the other things that we bring to bear in a crisis situation. So there was a lot of good, like collaborative, like how they do intel, how we do intel. Specifically for this one, the focus was like more operational prep of the environment. So that was pretty cool to see that in action and kind of collaborate efforts between all of our humans and counterintelligence, signals intelligence, all the weird toys, the regimental reconnaissance, how the ODAs were out there, the civil affairs teams, and working with them and kind of putting all those pieces together.
Were those reports like making it to you? Were you, since you were command relationship wise underneath the siege of SOTF, were you getting information out of the operational detachment alphas and the civil affair teams? Like, were you able to see their reports? Were you guys reporting directly to the CJSOTF, like whatever you guys were doing?
It wasn't so much direct, other than direct to the CJSOTF. There wasn't too much bilat between us and the ODAs directly. But it was still pretty good, like, communications flow. I think going up from them to the CJSOTF, coming back down to us, and then vice versa. We had our intelligence collectors and recce units out there, and they were reporting stuff up to the CJSOTF back down to the ODAs. Mind you, just a little bit of difference and nuance between what they were doing with unconventional warfare activities versus what kind of preparation activities we were doing, or advanced force operations we were doing, really to set up what our bread and butter is to, hey, set up this airfield for a Ranger battalion to come in, jump in, and wreak havoc. So
yeah, I think there was a little bit of different scenarioisms in what you guys were doing versus what 7th Group was focused on. But in your training and operational experience, is that normal for you, for Ranger to fall under a CJSOTF, a Combined Joint Special Operations Task Force?
No, it was not. And we certainly, like, I think we had a meeting, and luckily we did this several weeks before we kind of did a academy. I'm trying to remember exactly what we called it. We called it something like academy. And we put the entire staff between STB and RMIB all together in a conference room. And we had somebody who was a little bit more like well-spoken to this, special forces, like doctrine, get up and basically explain, like, hey, here's what a CJSOTF is, here's what a SOTF is, here's what an AOB is. And so we all learned from the ground and, like, understand, it was like, hey, this is going to be a little bit different than how we normally operate, but we're this O5 headquarters right here, and showed the line and block chart underneath the CJSOTF, and essentially what our, like, left and right limits, what our requirements would be to them. So ultimately, like, that kind of like eased the blow, if you will, once we actually got on the ground, and we started having to actually, like, communicate together. But it meshed pretty well. There certainly were not any issues, and it was a good learning experience because it was a little bit different than what we're used to.
Okay, so anything in particular you took away from your NTC or JRTC experience that you've used since then to help you?
Really, for me, just with my background and what I'm responsible for at Regiment, kind of ties in a lot with what ODAs do, specifically as far as, like, prep of the environment. Mind you, all from a human intelligence or counterintelligence perspective, but understanding, what their role is during phase 0, and how we can kind of, like, bridge the gap between what it is they're doing with unconventional warfare, tied into what our requirements are going to be to kind of, like, shift the focus from sabotage and destroy, use surrogates to do things, how that can be intelligence reported to inform, like, my commander on, hey, this is what you get from a human intelligence lens. So kind of understanding that was pretty cool to see. That was probably my biggest takeaway, was just that interoperability.
Yeah, it's huge. No, we stress that interoperability, interdependence, integration across the joint force. We talk a lot about special operations and conventional force integration, etc. But, like, even within special operations and then at the larger joint, be training on that, because it is a big effort. I mean, you talked about joint force entry operations for Ranger Regiment. Like, well, joint is the first part of that. You're not just Army guys doing Army things. It's a whole of DoD approach, right? The joint effort there. So when you turn over your position to the next guy, say if there was another CTC on the horizon, what advice would you give them to prepare?
Well, I'll tell you, I already know who my replacement is, and he's going to be well prepared because he's an S2 at a Special Forces battalion right now. So breathe, SF mentality, but also his prior Ranger experience. So for me specifically, he'll be fine. But I'll certainly have some notes for him because yeah, a lot of this stuff can be a little bit trickier in real time.
You mentioned within 75th focused on the National Training Center rotation and doing bi-weekly targeting meetings like in the leader training program, like when you were in 75th for either rotation coming out to JRTC or NTC, meeting with the Special Operations Training Detachment and like the planners and trying to like get the scenario groundwork laid, or doing an MD&P cycle on how to approach large-scale conflict for special operations, or like what, if anything, did you do besides those meetings you already mentioned?
Yeah, so we did LTP. It was in January of 2023, and yeah, exactly all those things. It was essentially another staff X, but really like all hands on deck, the entire regimental staff, RMIB, Special Troops Battalion, planners from the two Ranger battalions that participated. So we had a lot of people in the room at a single time for the first time in a long time. So it was a really good experience, and we definitely like got our initial plan for it put together, like all the initial like operations order, going through MD&P, IPB during that time. So yeah, also another like challenging but rewarding experience in and of itself.
Yeah, definitely. So does your job as military intelligence end during mission analysis? Or does it continue throughout the whole process?
No, it's continual. Intelligence and targeting is a cycle. It's never done. You're always like revalidating your assessments because they're inherently going to be wrong, or they're going to be off information that you gather from that ground force, that whatever they're reporting, and then you further corroborate that, and that helps drive the targeting cycle onto the next one.
And then we're out here for NTC because it was scale combat operations environment, even though it was a lot of. Was there crosstalk between the regiment and the division or the corps about how does these targets that regiment's going after versus what the conventional units like? Was there a lot of integration and crosstalk there?
Oh yeah. There was we ended up providing, I can't remember the exact number, but we had a pretty robust exercise control group, but also like they were acting as the HICON from regiment. So we constantly had to report to them and update the joint priorities target list. So that was, yeah. And I was specifically like seeing a lot of that at the 06 headquarters. So yeah, there was certainly a lot of crosstalk and balancing, like what were the joint task force priorities versus what was like, this Ranger battalion's priorities and how did that nest. So yeah, a lot of crosstalk, they stressed us. So
okay, well that's good. Sure. And it might have been a little bit different because there wasn't like an actual conventional brigade conducting a rotation while 75th was here at National Training Center that particular time.
Sure. But
what we always talk about when we have special forces companies, civil affairs, and PSYOP here is it's a resource constrained environment in terms of it's not necessarily that they're limited because there's fewer resources, but they're limited because we're no longer the main effort, the decisive operation. We're supporting the conventional force, and the conventional force is going to get a lot of those particular resources like fires or other things. Is that something that was stressed during that rotation, or because you were the main, not so stressed for the regiment?
Yeah, definitely not so stressed. Probably until like the last day or two, whenever we saw in the battle space that it's like, okay, I can't remember what division it was. I think it might have been a made-up division anyway. But whenever they started to get into contact with the enemy force, and then we were starting to scale back. Yeah, so that's whenever we kind of started to see our assets, like our air assets and information collection assets kind of like fall off a little bit. But for most of the rotation, at least 80% of it, yeah, there was no challenge other than between our two Ranger battalions of like knife fight on who gets this asset this day or at this time.
Gotcha.
So
So after that experience, how does the regiment see itself, 75th Ranger see itself in the large scale combat operation, like peer near peer fight, if we do get into one in the future?
yeah, I think it's the biggest thing. I kind of alluded to this earlier, but it's creating those windows of opportunity, of relative superiority into a contested environment, severely contested, that no one else is capable of doing, and seizing that key terrain for brief periods of time, to give access to more combat power to infill into that place. And then from there, moving on into deep strikes, whether that's scaled from all the way as low as a single high value individual, which we did practice that at NTC. We kind of proved like, hey, all the lessons of 20 years of GWAT, we certainly still applied. Like our high HVI number one was Black Horse 6, and I'm pretty sure we got him. I can't remember what day. But like we demonstrated all that too. Is like, hey, like, from HVI as the single like surgical strike all the way up to multi-battalion airfield seizure. So anything in between that spectrum, I think, is on the table for large scale combat operations, and 75th is definitely going to have a dog in the fight.
Absolutely. I think that was a great answer. But fantastic answer. Anything you'd like to talk about comparing station training versus CTCs?
I think really the only note I'd have on that is it's comparable, and we certainly got good training out there. I think in our organization though, Rangers are designed like for like sprints. Like it's very hit hard, hit fast, pull out, and CTCs are more or less designed for like very long duration, defensive style fighting, like transitions between offense and defense. That's just not quite baked into our DNA as Rangers. So that was like one major difference, I'd say. But I mean, we certainly played around with it. So,
and then, is there any advice you'd like to give to anyone that's interested in going to Ranger assessments?
Yeah. So I think I've got about 3 things that I tell people. I've had plenty of lieutenants in past units come up to me and ask for advice. NCOs, warrant officers as well. It's all applicable because you don't wear rank at RASP. You show up, whether you're going to RASP 1 or you show up to RASP 2, you are a leader, but you don't have rank on. So the first thing I'd say is, PT is absolutely critical. Not just at RASP during the whole 3 weeks of it, but for your duration of time as a Ranger. Like, you're expected to be physically fit, and specifically in like functional fitness. So you're going to be asked, and you're going to have to scale obstacles, climb ropes, move weight over distance. So that's the first thing I'd give. The second thing I'd give, we kind of already talked about this, but if you can get your tab before going to RASP 2, it's going to make your life a little bit easier and your application a little bit easier. You have to fight for it, especially as a lower density, but it really does help you stand out. You're not going to get rejected from applying, but you're going to have less of a steeper climb to get through. And really what I'd say to elaborate a little bit further on that is like you got to, typically in a conventional unit, you have to fight to get a slot for Ranger school. You have to have that aggressive mentality to be in this organization as well. So try and fight for it at your previous unit if you can. But if you can't, it's not going to be a game stopper. And then the last thing, I think most important out of any of these, you got to know yourself. You got to know your strengths and your weaknesses. It's a mantle and principle of our leadership philosophy here. Like, every Ranger staff sergeant or higher is a leader. Like, no ifs, ands, or buts. Like, no matter what section of the staff you're on, or if you're a Ranger squad leader, like you are a leader of something or of other Rangers, and you're expected to lead Rangers whenever you see them and they need leadership. So I can't stress that enough. Knowing yourself is a big part of this assessment, and feedback from your peers, your subordinates, your superiors. Just ask them, hey, what do you think? What do you think of me? Like, what are my strengths and weaknesses, and help that kind of like shape your understanding of yourself. Because yeah, it's going to be expected of you to be a leader here, and you can't lead if you don't know those things. Yeah, so
Awesome.
I think those are my three.
Great advice. I did remember what I wanted to say about your talk about 75th and large scale combat. Just if you're unaware, and you can take this back to 75th. My time here has been punctuated by hearing conventional units talk about convergence windows, and even SF units. And I was told that came from 75th's rotation here. And you did talk about convergence windows. So like, that's great. It's percolating across the force. We are getting soldiers, leaders to understand like, combined arms maneuver within multi-domain, and then getting all of these things in time and space so that we can have whatever effect we're trying to have. And I think that what you talked about with 75th and large-scale combat operations was a fantastic answer. And it is like, boom, 75th's here, conventionals doing XYZ, and then we have the rest of RSOF over here, and it all supports each other. Sure. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk and coming out here. You're the first 75th Ranger that I've invited on. I'd love to talk to more and get their perspective, so I might ask you for anyone that may, again, in the future. And
absolutely.
You gave me a lot to think about. I'm going to have to re-listen to this and learn, just whatever else I can glean about military intelligence from you. And I appreciate this conversation. So I'll let you close us out.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Wes. This is it's been a pleasure chatting with you, chatting about these things, nerding out a little bit in our profession. I guess I'll close it with a couple words, really more for the audience, and try and demystify a couple other things about our organization. So I guess first is like, we're a standards-based organization, no matter MOS. So every intelligence professional is a Ranger first. But don't, if that doesn't sound like you, like, don't let that discourage you entirely from trying to join the regiment. You'll figure out like if you belong here or not while you go through that selection or even beforehand. But if you're having some doubts, like regardless of your MS or experience, like, don't doubt yourself. 10 years ago, I never would have thought I would have been here. But it took over years of mental and physical preparation. I put in the work every day, and then I believed in myself and dropped my packet, and then it's all paid off. I'll tell you, no one here is perfect, but everyone here does give 100% and then some. It's in our creed. That's expected of you. We all understand, like, hey, this guy's got weaknesses. I've got my own weaknesses, but we leverage our strengths and work around and support each other. It really is an iron sharpen iron place and culture here. And then really the last thing, just again, to get this out to the audience, so there's a better understanding across the force. We're founded on the principles of Creighton Abrams charters. And what that means is like, we're designed to give back to the regular Army, whether that's like fielding new equipment, demonstrating different tactics or techniques, or even just general leadership, like sending Ranger NCOs and officers back into the regular force and elevating the conventional force with lessons learned. We're all on the same team. So that's why we're here. And we're all one team. We're all in this fight together.
Thank you for listening to Off the Radar, where RSOF prepares for conflict. Like, subscribe, and share on your listening platform. Actions will determine the outcome.